The Last Normal Morning, August 28th, 2005, New Orleans, Louisiana, 6:14 a.m. The sun rises slow and golden over the Mississippi River Delta. On Bourbon Street, the last confetti from last night's revelry still skitters across the pavement. A street sweeper pushes his broom in long, lazy arcs. A pelican glides low over the water, its wings barely moving. This is Sunday morning. This is home. In the Ninth Ward, Maria Toureau lays her 4-year-old daughter's church dress across the bed. The little girl is still sleeping, arms stretched out like she owns the world. Maria smiles. She can smell coffee from downstairs. Her husband is already up, already humming something from the radio. In Lakeview, a retired firefighter named Gerald Brooks waters his garden. He has had that garden for 31 years. Roses, dahlias, and a lemon tree his father planted before he died. The air is thick and hot, the way Louisiana air always is in August. Heavy, like the atmosphere itself is breathing. On Canal Street, a delivery driver named Calvin drops off the Sunday papers. The headline above the fold, Katrina intensifies. He glances at it. He has seen a dozen storms. He tosses the bundle on the sidewalk and drives away. The city does not know what is coming. It does not know that within 48 hours, 80% of its streets will be underwater. That over 1,800 people will be dead. That 100,000 residents will lose everything they own, their homes, their memories, their neighborhoods, forever. It does not know that the most powerful nation on earth will watch it drown on the live television and do almost nothing for 5 days. The coffee is still warm. The roses are still blooming. The little girl in the Ninth Ward is still dreaming. This is the last morning New Orleans will ever be the same. A city built on dreams and water. New Orleans was not just a city, it was a myth. A living, breathing fever dream of music, food, architecture, and defiance that had no equal anywhere in the United States, and arguably anywhere in the world. Founded in 1718 by French colonists who had absolutely no business building a city in a swamp, New Orleans had survived hurricanes, floods, yellow fever epidemics, fires, and wars. It had been ruled by the French, then the Spanish, then the French again, then sold to Thomas Jefferson like furniture. It absorbed African, Caribbean, Native American, and European cultures and alchemized them into something entirely its own. Jazz, Creole cuisine, Mardi Gras, and the Second Line Parade. By 2005, the Greater New Orleans metropolitan area was home to 1.3 million people. The Port of New Orleans was the 5th largest port in the world by cargo volume. The city's tourism industry generated $5 billion a year. Its music, Louis Armstrong, Fats Domino, Professor Longhair, the Neville Brothers, had shaped the entire history of American popular music. The French Quarter was filled with century-old iron lace balconies draped in bougainvillea. In the Garden District, mansions the size of city blocks stood behind white picket fences, surrounded by live oak trees draped in Spanish moss. In the 7th Ward, second-line brass bands still practiced in living rooms on Tuesday nights. In Treme, the oldest black neighborhood in the United States, families had lived on the same block for 4 and 5 generations. But this was a city with a memory, a city with a soul. Residents spoke of New Orleans the way people speak of a person they love, protectively, with the private knowledge that this city was irreplaceable, that there was no substitute, that to lose it would be to lose something the world could never grow back. They were right. The city that knew it was sinking. Here is what everyone already knew. New Orleans sits in a bowl, literally. The city is surrounded on 3 sides by water. Lake Pontchartrain to the north, the Mississippi River to the south, Lake Borgne and the Gulf of Mexico to the east. And unlike almost every other major American city, New Orleans does not sit above sea level. Most of it sits below sea level. Some neighborhoods sit 6, 7, 8 feet below the waterline. The city exists only because of a network of levees, earthen and concrete walls, that hold the surrounding water back. Every geologist in Louisiana knew this. Every civil engineer in the Army Corps knew this. Every mayor of New Orleans for the past century had known this. The city's vulnerability to catastrophic flooding in the event of a major hurricane was not a secret. It had been published in scientific papers, documented in congressional hearings, simulated in computer models, and outlined in a devastating 2002 series in the Times-Picayune titled Washing Away, which predicted, with terrifying accuracy, exactly what would happen if a Category 4 or 5 hurricane made landfall near the city. The levees protecting New Orleans were rated to withstand a Category 3 storm, nothing more. In 2004, the Federal Emergency Management Agency ran a simulation called Hurricane Pam, a hypothetical Category 3 storm making landfall just west of New Orleans. The results projected 61,000 dead, hundreds of thousands displaced, years of recovery. The report was filed. The funding requests were not approved. In the years leading up to 2005, the Army Corps of Engineers had repeatedly requested hundreds of millions of dollars to reinforce the levee system. Year after year, those requests were cut. "We'll be fine," a city official told a reporter in 2004, with the quiet confidence of a man who had never been proven wrong before. The residents believed him. They always had. They should not have. A monster growing in the Gulf. On August 23, 2005, a tropical depression formed over the Bahamas. Warm, disorganized, unremarkable. Within 24 hours, it had become Tropical Storm Katrina. Within 48 hours, it had crossed southern Florida, weakened slightly over land, and then, finding the extraordinarily warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, it began to feed. The Gulf of Mexico in late August 2005 was running at record temperatures. Warm water is the fuel of hurricanes. The warmer the water, the faster the storm intensifies. Katrina entered the Gulf as a Category 1. Within hours, it was a Category 2. Then, over a single overnight period on August 27th and 28th, something extraordinary and terrifying happened. Katrina underwent what meteorologists call rapid intensification. In 24 hours, its maximum sustained winds exploded from 115 miles per hour to 175 miles per hour. Its central pressure dropped to 902 millibars, making it, at that moment, the third lowest pressure ever recorded in an Atlantic hurricane. The storm grew to cover an area nearly the size of the entire Gulf Coast. The National Hurricane Center issued their warnings. The National Weather Service office in New Orleans sent a bulletin at 10:11 a.m. on August 28th that used language almost never seen in official forecasts. It warned of human suffering incredible by modern standards. It warned that the city would be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer. It warned that the aftermath would be a once-in-a-lifetime event. The warnings were received. They were received by a federal government stretched thin by 2 wars, by state and local governments that lacked resources and, in some cases, the will to act, by thousands of residents who had evacuated before, returned home to nothing. Everyone had stopped trusting the alarms. Katrina kept moving, 12 miles per hour, northwest, straight toward New Orleans. The clock was running. Sunday, August 28th. By Sunday morning, Mayor Ray Nagin had finally issued a mandatory evacuation order, the first in the city's history. It was 9:30 a.m. Katrina was projected to make landfall in less than 24 hours. For those with cars, money, and options, the evacuation was already well underway. Interstate 10, Interstate 55, Interstate 59, every highway leading out of the city was a parking lot. Families loaded minivans with photo albums, pet crates, and irreplaceable things they could carry in their arms. Gas stations ran out of fuel by midday. Hotels from Baton Rouge to Atlanta filled to capacity. The caravan of evacuees stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. But 100,000 people in New Orleans did not leave. Some could not afford to. They had no cars, no money for a hotel room, no family outside the city to stay with. They were the elderly, the disabled, the chronically ill, the poor, the people whom every emergency plan had somehow forgotten to actually account for. Some chose to stay. They had ridden out storms before. Their grandparents had ridden out storms before. Their houses were solid. Their block was home. They were not going anywhere. At the Louisiana Superdome, city officials opened the arena as a refuge of last resort for those who had nowhere else to go. By Sunday evening, nearly 10,000 people had taken shelter inside. The building had power. It had food rations for 3 days. Officials reassured everyone it would be temporary. The storm would pass, the water would drain, and everyone would be home by Tuesday. On Bourbon Street, a handful of tourists were still drinking. Someone was playing trumpet on a corner. The neon lights were on. Outside the city, 60 miles offshore, Katrina's eye wall was tightening. No one slept well that night. 2 a.m. the wind comes first. At 2 a.m. on Monday, August 29th, the outer bands of Hurricane Katrina began to roll across southeastern Louisiana. The first sign was the sound. People who lived through it describe it the same way, universally decades later. A low moan that grew into a scream, then into something beyond language. A sustained, crushing roar that sounded less like wind and more like the world tearing at its seams. Trees bent 45 degrees and stayed there. Window glass flexed inward like skin. Car alarms shrieked and then were swallowed by the greater noise. The rain came horizontal, not falling, flying. Sheets of water so dense that visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. Street signs spun off their poles. Patio furniture became projectiles. Power transformers exploded in blue-green flashes, one after another, neighborhoods going dark in sequence like candles being blown out across a table. Inside the Superdome, the 10,000 people sheltering inside heard the roof begin to give way. 2 holes tore open in the outer skin of the building. Rain poured in. The power flickered, failed, came back on emergency generators. Children screamed. Old men closed their eyes. A woman in the upper deck clutched a plastic bag containing every document that proved she existed. Birth certificate, social security card, the deed to her house. At 6:10 a.m., Katrina made landfall near Barras, Louisiana. Maximum sustained winds, 125 miles per hour. Storm surge, 25 to 28 feet along the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And then, beneath the wind and the rain and the roaring dark, something else began. The levees started to fail. There is no way out. The first levee failed at approximately 5 a.m., before Katrina had even officially made landfall. The 17th Street Canal levee, which separated Lake Pontchartrain from the city of New Orleans, did not overtop. It did not crack. The wall simply slid sideways into the earth, a catastrophic foundation failure that engineers would later describe as a foreseeable consequence of decades of deferred maintenance and underfunding. And the lake poured in. By 8 a.m., the London Avenue Canal had also breached. By mid-morning, the Industrial Canal gave way. Water was flowing into the city from multiple directions simultaneously, filling the bowl of New Orleans from the bottom upward, quietly, relentlessly, without pause. Cell phone networks, already overloaded with desperate calls, collapsed within hours. Landlines were gone. The internet was gone. Radio stations went dark one by one as their transmitters flooded. The city of New Orleans disappeared from the national communications grid as completely as if it had been erased. Roads out of the city became rivers. The I-10 twin spans connecting New Orleans to Slidell had sections sheared completely off. The Judge Perez Drive, Chef Montour Highway, gone. Anyone who had waited too long to evacuate now found every exit submerged. In the 9th Ward, residents who had gone to their second floors now watched the water climb to meet them. Now it came in silence, which was somehow worse than the storm. The roaring had been terrifying. This quiet rising was something else, like patient, unstoppable, indifferent. People climbed into their attics. Then they took axes and hammers to their own roofs to cut holes through which they could escape because the water was climbing in behind them. Some had axes, some did not. The city was now sealed. No way in, no way out. The water still rising. The city comes apart. By Monday afternoon, the scale of what was happening became impossible to deny. 80% of New Orleans was underwater. In the 9th Ward, the water had reached rooftops. Cars were submerged to their antennas. The signs of gas stations and fast food restaurants were half swallowed by brown, toxic water, a mix of lake water, sewage, industrial runoff, gasoline, and the contents of flooded cemeteries. In Louisiana, the dead are buried above ground. The coffins, torn loose by the flood, were floating. Entire city blocks had simply ceased to exist as dry land. Neighborhoods that had stood for 150 years were 10 feet underwater. The sound of the city had changed completely. Instead of traffic and music and voices, there was the slap of water against rooftops, the distant crack of something structural giving way, and the sound of people screaming for help from places no one could reach. Emergency services had collapsed. The police department had lost its own headquarters. The fire department could not move its trucks. The 911 system received thousands of calls from people trapped in attics and on rooftops, and dispatchers could do nothing but tell them to hang on. Looting began. Some of it was survival. People breaking into stores for water, food, diapers, insulin. Some of it was opportunistic chaos in a city that had lost all structure. The images that reached the outside world, almost exclusively images of black residents, were framed in ways that would generate controversy and outrage for years. On television, anchors spoke in stunned voices. Politicians issued statements. The President of the United States was at his ranch in Texas, having been briefed on the storm by video conference the day before. In New Orleans, people were clinging to rooftops and drowning in their attics. The two realities had not yet fully collided. The city drowns, Tuesday, August 30th, 2005. This is the day New Orleans died. The water had stopped rising, but it did not recede. It simply sat, a vast, still, poisoned lake where a city used to be. In every direction for miles there was nothing but rooftops and treetops, and the occasional second-floor window from which a hand waved a bedsheet or a shirt or anything that might be seen from the sky. The helicopters came. Not enough of them. Never enough. But they came, hovering over rooftops, lowering rescue baskets one at a time, pulling up the elderly and the screaming and the barely conscious. Pilots described hovering over one house, saving 4 people, and being able to see 40 more houses within eyeshot from which arms were waving. They could not get to them all. They could not come close to getting to them all. At the Superdome, conditions had descended into something that violated every expectation of what a civilized government could allow to happen to its citizens. And 20,000 people were now inside. The original 10,000 had been joined by thousands more who had arrived on foot after the storm. There was no air conditioning. There were not enough toilets. The backup generators were failing. The food was running out. Temperatures inside the dome climbed above 100 degrees. People were giving birth. People were dying. Bodies were laid in the corridors. Outside on the highway overpass above the flooded streets, thousands more sat in the open sun, with no water, no food, no shade, and no information about when, or if, help would arrive. Buses had been promised. No buses came. Day after day, no buses came. On the convention center, someone spray-painted a sign, "We are still here." The National Guard was coming. FEMA was coordinating. Federal resources were being mobilized. All of this was true. Yeah, but the mobilization moved at the speed of bureaucracy, while the dying moved at the speed of a Mississippi August. People died in the heat on the overpass. People died waiting in the Superdome. People died in attics where no one ever found them. Their bodies not discovered for weeks, for months, in some cases never formally identified. The greatest city in the American South was drowning in plain sight, and the country watched on television. What we left behind. Her name was Ethel Freeman. She was 91 years old. Her son Herbert had pushed her in her wheelchair to the Ernest N. Morial Convention Center, which city officials had designated as another gathering point for displaced residents. There was no plan. There was no food, there was no water, there was no medical support. The city had told people to go there and then, essentially, forgotten about them. Herbert stayed by his mother's side through the first day. Through the second, he fanned her with a piece of cardboard. He begged National Guardsmen passing in trucks for water. He was told help was coming. Help was always coming. On the third day, in the brutal heat, with no water and no medical care, Ethel Freeman died in her wheelchair. Herbert did not leave her. He sat beside her body for more than a day in the open heat, guarding her, refusing to let her be simply set aside like a piece of discarded cargo. When journalists photographed the scene, it became one of the defining images of the disaster. Not the floodwaters, not the collapsed buildings, but a son sitting next to his dead mother in a wheelchair on an American street, in an American city, abandoned by his government, Herbert Freeman Jr. Ibidin would later say, "She didn't deserve to die like that. Nobody deserves to die like that." He was right. Across the city, thousands of stories just like his were unfolding. Invisible, unwitnessed, unrecorded. Elderly men and women dying alone in flooded houses. Parents making impossible decisions about which child to carry and which to hold. People discovering, in the worst possible way, exactly how alone they were. The flood did not drown them equally. It drowned the ones who had been left at the bottom of everything long before the water came. What the water left behind. When the floodwaters finally began to recede, not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly over weeks, what they revealed was not a city. It was an archaeological site. Houses tilted off their foundations at impossible angles. Cars were deposited on top of fences and in the upper branches of trees. An entire neighborhood in the 9th Ward had been essentially scraped clean. The houses not merely flooded, but physically moved, smashed, dissolved back into the earth by the force of the water that had rushed through when the industrial canal gave way. The concrete slabs where houses had stood were bare and gray, like tombstones for buildings. The smell is the thing survivors mention most. A smell of rot and mud and sewage and something chemical and something else that everyone recognized but no one wanted to name. It was the smell of death, and it was everywhere. It was in the walls of every house, in every piece of furniture, in every carpet, in every item of clothing left hanging in a closet. The smell of New Orleans after Katrina was a physical presence. It followed rescue workers and journalists and survivors out of the city in their clothes, in their hair, in their lungs. Survivors emerged from their houses, blinking in the sudden silence. Some of them had been in their attics for 5 days with no food and no water, and no contact with anyone. They had scratched messages into their walls. They had kept count of the days. Some of them were barely alive. The National Guard finally arrived in force. Search and rescue teams from across the country followed. And what they found, house by house, block by block, confirmed what everyone had feared. The death toll was going to be catastrophic. New Orleans was not damaged. New Orleans was gone. What no one wanted to show. The network showed the rescues. They showed the helicopters. They showed the reunions and the survivors lifted to safety. They showed much less of what came after. In the weeks that followed, recovery teams moved through the flooded neighborhoods, marking houses with a now infamous code. An X spray-painted on the exterior, divided into 4 quadrants. Top quadrant, the date the house was searched. Left quadrant, the team that searched it. Bottom quadrant, the number of bodies found inside. Some houses had zeros, some had 1s or 2s. A house in the 9th ward had the number 7. The bodies of those who died in their attics, in their bedrooms, in their wheelchairs on their front porches. They had been in the heat and the water for days, in some cases for weeks. Recovery workers wore hazmat suits. The psychological toll on those workers, police officers, firefighters, volunteers, National Guard soldiers, was severe and lasting. The post-traumatic stress disorder rates among Katrina first responders were among the highest ever recorded for any American disaster. The floodwater itself was declared a biohazardous material. It contained raw sewage, industrial chemicals, heavy metals, and pathogens. Children who waded through it developed skin infections. Adults who breathed the contaminated air developed respiratory conditions that persisted for years. Entire neighborhoods were officially condemned. The city government, facing the reality of what reconstruction would cost, began raising quiet questions about which neighborhoods were worth rebuilding at all. The lower 9th ward, historically one of the highest rates of black home ownership in the country, was at the center of those questions. The survivors noticed who was being asked to give up and move on. They noticed, and they always noticed, the long way back. The numbers were staggering and almost impossible to absorb. 1,833 confirmed dead. An additional 135 people listed as missing. Their fates never officially resolved. $125 billion in damage. At the time, the costliest natural disaster in American history. 400,000 people permanently displaced. The population of New Orleans, which had stood at 484,000 before the storm, fell to under 200,000 by 2006. Some neighborhoods never recovered their population. Some neighborhoods were never rebuilt at all. The federal response became the subject of congressional investigations, independent commissions, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning series of reports. FEMA Director Michael Brown was forced to resign. The Army Corps of Engineers publicly acknowledged that the levee failures were the result of engineering errors, not simply the overwhelming force of the storm. This was not Katrina, one Corps official stated in 2006. This was us. The rebuilding of New Orleans was long, uneven, and politically fraught. Federal road home funds meant to help homeowners rebuild were distributed in a formula that systematically undervalued homes in black neighborhoods, a disparity that led to a class action lawsuit that took years to resolve. Charity Hospital, a public hospital that had served the city's poorest residents for over 250 years, was never reopened. The public school system was essentially dissolved and replaced with a charter school network, a transformation that education reformers praised and community members often mourned. The musicians came back, the restaurants came back, the French Quarter came back, Jazz Fest came back, the Saints came back and, in 2010, won the Super Bowl, and the city celebrated in the streets with a grief and a joy that were indistinguishable from each other. But 100,000 people who left never returned. Their houses are empty lots now. Their neighborhoods are quieter. Their children grew up somewhere else and call somewhere else home. The bowl still exists. The city still sits below sea level. The new levees are stronger. They can withstand a Category 3 storm now, maybe a Category 4. The Gulf of Mexico is warmer every decade. The hurricanes are more powerful every generation. The lesson has not yet been fully learned. What we owe the dead. There is a temptation 20 years later to call Hurricane Katrina a natural disaster. It was not. The hurricane was natural. What happened to New Orleans was a human disaster, constructed over decades by choices made and choices avoided, by money appropriated and money withheld, by warnings heard and warnings ignored, by a government that knew, precisely specifically in documented detail, that its citizens were vulnerable and chose, year after year, not to spend what it would have cost to protect them. The 17th Street Canal levee did not fail because the storm was too powerful. It failed because it was not built well enough, because the funding to build it better had been cut, because the people who lived behind it were not powerful enough to make anyone care. Ethel Freeman did not die in her wheelchair on an American street because there was nothing that could have been done. She died because no one in power thought her life was worth the logistics of getting her out. Every number in this story, every one of the 1,833 confirmed dead, was a person who deserved better from the place they called home. We tell this story not because it is history. We tell it because the conditions that produced it, the underfunded infrastructure, the expendable poor, the bureaucratic indifference, the gap between the warning and the action, are not historical. They are present. They are here. They are operating right now. in cities across this country and across this world, waiting for the next storm. New Orleans still exists. It is smaller, different, changed in ways that are still being negotiated. It still has the music. It still has the food. It still has the second line and the Mardi Gras and the particular untranslatable light that falls on the Mississippi at dusk. But 1,833 people never got to see any of it again. And we owe it to every one of them to look clearly at what happened and to choose this time to do better. The water is always rising somewhere. The question is whether we will be ready.